He ordered the surgeon present a man named Lion to cut the tendons and muscles at the joints with a knife. Surgeon Lion initially refused. He said he was a healer, not a torturer, but he was ordered under penalty of imprisonment. So he climbed onto the platform in the March cold, avoided looking at Damien's face, and with a surgical blade cut the tendons of the elbows, the biceps tendon, the triceps tendon, the ligaments holding the humerus to the radius and ulna, then the knees, the patellar tendon, the cruciate ligaments, the connective tissue binding femur to tibia. When the horses pulled again with the tendons severed, the limbs finally began to separate. First, the right arm, the skin tearing, the remaining muscle fibers snapping, blood spraying across the frozen platform. Then, the left leg, then the others. And Damien's was still alive. Witnesses report that after 3 limbs were torn off, he still spoke. The words were not coherent. Just sounds, moans, attempts at prayer, but he was conscious through it all. The human body can survive catastrophic trauma for minutes, even after limbs are removed, as long as the torso and head remain intact. Only when the 4th limb was removed, approximately 3 hours and 45 minutes after the beginning, did he finally lose consciousness from blood loss and shock. But his heart continued beating for another 15 minutes while the dismembered torso bled on the frozen platform. Steam rising from the blood pooling in the March cold. The final phase was destruction of the body. Damien's remains were collected, the limbless torso, the 4 severed limbs placed on a pyre, and burned while the crowd watched in stunned silence. The ashes were scattered. All his properties were confiscated. The house where he was born was demolished. His family was exiled. The name Damien's was forbidden. It was an attempt to erase his existence completely. But the public reaction was unexpected. Instead of intimidating the population, the execution caused widespread revulsion. Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire wrote condemnations, stating that the barbarity of the punishment exceeded the barbarity of the crime 1,000 times. They argued that the brutality of the state was worse than Damien's crime, that a civilized society could not justify such methods, and the seeds of change were planted on that frozen March day, 3 decades later during the French Revolution. Such executions were abolished, ironically replaced by the guillotine, invented to be merciful, instant death. No prolonged torture. And although the guillotine had its own horrors, especially during the Terror, it was a recognition that the old methods were unacceptable. But why did 3 assistant executioners refuse to participate before the execution even began? Records show that professional executioners had a code. They did the work because someone had to do it. The law required execution, and they were the designated officials, but there were limits. Executions should be efficient, relatively quick. Death should come as swiftly as the law allowed. Prolonging agony unnecessarily was seen as excessive cruelty even by their standards, and the dismemberment of Damien's crossed that line. Especially because everyone knew the injury to the king was not serious, a superficial stab wound that healed in weeks. The punishment was grotesquely disproportionate, and this troubled even men whose job was to kill. Jean Martin, Pierre Duchamp, and François Leblanc, the 3 who refused, lost their positions and income. But they found other work as laborers and craftsmen. And decades later, when the guillotine was adopted, Descendants of Martin returned to the profession because the changed method was something they could execute without moral remorse. The guillotine's blade fell in seconds. There was no prolonged suffering. That was the difference. Was Damiens a villain or a victim? He committed a crime. He attacked the king with a knife. But he was clearly mentally disturbed. In the modern era, he would be hospitalized, evaluated, treated for what we now recognize as paranoid schizophrenia. But in 1757, madness was not a defense against treason, and the punishment he received was so extreme that it transformed him from a criminal into a martyr in the eyes of many. The story of Damiens is a reminder that states use extreme violence to maintain power, that public brutality can have the opposite effect to that intended, that progress in human rights is measured in specific practices society decides not to tolerate anymore. Dismemberment was one. Witch burning was another. Slavery was a third. And each abolition was fought by those who argued the old methods were necessary. That change would lead to chaos. But change came. The execution of Damiens was a turning point the last time France applied complete medieval punishment. The horror it generated accelerated reforms that would eventually transform the entire judicial system. Not immediately. The revolution was 3 decades away. But the seeds were planted on that day at Place de Grève, when even the crowd accustomed to public violence decided there was a limit. 10,000 people came expecting a spectacle in the freezing March morning. Perhaps 3,000 remained until the end. The rest left, not necessarily out of pity for Damiens, but because they could no longer watch. They walked away through the frozen streets. Some vomiting in alleys, some crying, some simply numb. And this inability, this fundamental human limit to witness suffering, was more powerful than any law. Because when a society collectively decides that something is unbearable to watch, it eventually decides that it is unbearable to do. Damiens died in the most horrible way imaginable under French law on that frozen March day. But his death was not in vain. Not because he was a hero, he was not. He was a confused man who committed a violent act. But because the brutality of the punishment revealed something about the society that administered it, that a state willing to torture for 4 hours in a public square was morally bankrupt. And the recognition of this slow and gradual led to changes that benefited countless future condemned prisoners who at least died quickly. That, in the context of execution history, counts as progress. Grim, minimal, but progress nonetheless. The 3 executioners who refused Jean Martin, Pierre Duchamp, François Leblanc were vindicated by history. Their refusal to participate in that frozen March horror became a footnote, but an important one. It proved that even within systems of institutional violence, individuals could recognize when a line had been crossed, that even professional killers could say this is too much. The frozen blood on Place de Grève was washed away within days. The platform was dismantled. Life in Paris continued, but the memory of what happened on March 28, 1757, in that late winter cold, lingered. If you want more historical reality about how societies justified institutional cruelty, subscribe to Flow of History. We're revealing what actually happened behind the legends.